Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the new discoveries from the last few months in regards to the dangers of space exploration, or more specifically, the idea of space health. Something we discussed in some of the previous videos you can find in the description, and something that's actually exceptionally important for the upcoming Artemis mission, Artemis 1 mission, and also the potential crewed mission to Mars. And this is of course why a lot of scientists in the last few months and the last few years have been actively trying to figure out exactly what happens to the human body as it travels in the outer space, and more importantly, as it lives in these zero gravity conditions. And so in this video we're going to be discussing several different studies, actually quite a lot of different studies, that focus on some of these new discoveries and potential resolutions to some of the problems discovered. And although all of these studies are going to be in no particular order, I actually wanted to start with the one that was just released a couple of days ago from when I'm making the video. A study that naturally you can find in the description below. And in this case, the scientists behind the study examined blood samples from 14 different NASA astronauts that flew between 1998 and 2001, discovering that pretty much all of them developed various types of mutations in their DNA, with the biggest mutation causing what's known as hematopoiesis, usually caused by the majority of the blood cells in the body being produced by just a few clones, as opposed to a much wider variety of the initial cells that produce blood, with a lot of other small mutations detected as well. And though none of them resulted in anything serious, all of this of course suggests that by staying in space long enough, this can actually result in some serious mutations. But technically none of this is really new to us. A lot of medical tests have been conducted in the last 2 decades, but a lot of exciting ones were only conducted in the last couple of years. And even a few weeks ago, the astronauts on the International Space Station were required to conduct several medical tests, including the tests wearing various electrodes, and tests that monitor the blood flow in the head and the chest. NASA actually developed this device known as Ultrasound 2, which to some extent was inspired by some of the medical devices in the Star Trek series, that's able to scan various body parts of astronauts, including their eyes, determining if there are any serious medical issues that need to be resolved. None of this is naturally automated like in Star Trek, and it still requires a medical doctor that knows how to use all of this, but still kind of cool. And so by using all of these really complex medical devices, NASA started to discover some really important things about the human body. And one of the first major discoveries back in the days was actually in regards to the way that the fluids in our body tend to shift because of the gravity. In the microgravity conditions, the fluid shifts to the top half of our body, which ends up triggering quite a lot of unneeded responses. For example, it ends up producing a lot of interesting signals in our body that tell our body that we need to pee. And so because of this, in the first few weeks, astronauts actually have to go to the toilet quite a lot. And because of this, they also end up always feeling thirsty and always end up being dehydrated as well. But later on, when they come back to Earth, because of the misbalance in the fluid distribution, it causes some of the astronauts to faint, and sometimes even produces serious medical emergencies. So today the scientists believe that by spending approximately 6 months in outer space in these microgravity conditions, any astronaut then landing on Mars might actually end up experiencing serious medical emergencies as well. But unlike here on Earth, there's going to be nobody to help them if anything goes bad. And so relatively recently, the scientists from Australia started to work on a kind of a model that can actually help us predict if something similar can actually happen to a specific astronaut traveling to Mars for 6 months. A model entirely based on our current understanding of how our cardiovascular system works and what happens to it in microgravity conditions. But that's of course just one of the issues: blood and circulation. We have 5 more to discuss. Let's start with the slightly more unusual one. The one we don't really get to see or talk about much. The bacteria inside our bodies, specifically in our guts. And their importance was discussed in one of the previous videos about our gut and how the bacteria here influence everything in our bodies. But one particular thing that has been ignored so far in many studies is how exactly physical forces, and specifically microgravity conditions, affect the bacteria inside of us as well. Because as I mentioned in that previous video, by keeping our gut healthy, we'll keep ourselves happy and healthy as well. And so unfortunately this is just one of the very few studies that so far has tackled the idea of bacteria effects on human body. With this particular study focusing on a bacteria that's generally not particularly needed in our bodies, Salmonella, the pathogen that generally causes a lot of problems inside of us. But because it's so easy to study, the scientists wanted to start here and they wanted to see what effects the microgravity is going to have on the bacteria itself and the interaction with our body. And the idea here was pretty simple. Put the Salmonella bacteria with cells very similar to the ones we find in our body and try to see how it actually acts on those cells and how it interacts with them if placed into conditions similar to microgravity and outer space, and similar to what we find on the International Space Station. And their discovery is pretty important. They discovered that the actual physical forces that we usually refer to as fluid shear forces change quite dramatically in this case. So because microgravity conditions tend to change the way that fluids flow on the inside, and specifically they essentially reduce the amount of these downstream currents that generally affect the way that the cells evolve, the actual cells tend to evolve slightly differently and produce different genes as a result. And so when they took these Salmonella bacteria that were raised in these conditions, and then introduced them to the cells very similar to the ones in our body, the new Salmonella cells infected the human tissue much more effectively and produced much worse effects. Which of course implies two things. First, any potential pathogen can actually become much more deadly or much more dangerous if it spends long enough time in micro-G conditions and evolves some of these characteristics. But second of all, it also implies that some of the bacteria that already live in our body, and there are quite a lot of them out there, also have a potential to mutate and thus change their characteristics quite dramatically, potentially becoming dangerous or potentially becoming useless, which means that it's going to affect our body one way or another. With all this, because of this liquid abrasion of cell surfaces that's generally referred to as fluid shear, with this shear stress then producing various effects in these bacteria. But considering the amount of bacteria in our bodies and also considering the fact that everybody on the planet has generally different bacteria inside of them, it really means that it's more or less unpredictable what's actually going to happen to an individual, and here we're talking about an actual astronaut, living in space long enough as the bacteria inside of them evolves and potentially becomes either useless or dangerous. Which of course just means that more studies are needed. Okay, next on the list is something that we've known about for a long time. The astronaut's vision. We know that it changes quite dramatically by living in zero-G conditions, because of the fluid distribution as the fluid migrates to the upper region of the body. And approximately 1/3 of all astronauts that lived on the International Space Station long enough experienced major changes in their vision, with those living for up to 6 months usually experiencing it much more severely. And because of these fluid changes, the swelling at the back of the eye surrounding the optic nerve tends to lead to some long-term changes in vision that unfortunately cannot be fixed even after returning to planet Earth. And though in some cases they do actually resolve after approximately 1 year, a few astronauts have never regained their vision after living in space long enough. Although the effects on the optic nerve are just some of the ones discovered so far, it's quite possible that there is also a genetic component, and it's also quite possible that there are other components here as well that have not been discovered yet. The effects though are real and measurable, and so any astronaut going to Mars for 6 months, by the time that they land on Mars, might actually experience really bad vision on top of all of the other issues as well. And so not having fully functioning vision is one of many problems future Martian astronauts might have to face. But that's just the beginning. We have the bigger problem here, the brain. Brain too undergoes some major changes in microgravity conditions, and some of these changes seem to be more or less permanent as well. This relatively recent study that focused on 15 astronaut brains and their MRI scans before and after the International Space Station focused on the size of what's known as perivascular spaces. These are spaces in our brain that generally allow various fluids to pass in order to essentially clean the brain. And interestingly, veteran astronauts, the ones that spent months or years in space, did not generally have much difference here, but first-time astronauts had a major increase in size of these perivascular spaces, which also would generally put more pressure on the brain when the astronauts would return to Earth. In a sense, think of this as suddenly having a lot more fluid in your brain, and so when you return to gravity conditions, things might not really be as comfortable anymore. Although right now it's not particularly clear exactly what effects it's going to have long term, or if there are any potential health risks that we have to be aware of. Generally, these particular regions are used when we sleep. They seem to play a role in removing waste from our brains, the waste that accumulates while we're active. But intriguingly enough, the same study also discovered that 8 out of 24 astronauts whose MRIs were studied also had a much higher swelling of white matter in their brain and their spinal cord but also experience major vision problems, so there actually could be a connection here with some of the vision loss as well. Although intriguingly enough, as I mentioned, some of the more experienced astronauts did not really have major changes afterwards. The scientists believe it's because they reached some kind of a homeostasis or some kind of a balance. But I guess what's unusual is that because of these changes in these ventricle spaces, it also seems to affect some of the other brain regions as well, mostly because of the additional pressure that it causes on the brain, which also ends up shifting some of the brain tissue from one region to another. And so there's definitely a significant change in the brain in terms of the structure and the shape. And this also might affect the way that we start acting and the way we start thinking as well. And on top of this other study from just a few months ago had also discovered that the brains of various astronauts seem to undergo major structural changes, rewiring a lot of these signals in the process. And so in some sense you can actually see this as a slightly different person coming back to Earth from the one who left. The way that they think about things, the way that they sort of understand things would be slightly different because of these connectivity and structural changes. But until future studies, we're not really going to know much more. Next on the list, muscles. And in this case, we actually do discover something really interesting that potentially has a solution. The scientists have known for many years that muscles in space generally become weaker and weaker and at some point become almost useless. For example, muscles that are responsible for maintaining our posture or allowing us to move against the gravity tend to completely become useless when there is no gravity to speak of. And in this case, the human calf muscles dramatically reduce their volume in space. And so in this case, trying to walk on Mars after 6 months in microgravity is going to be almost impossible. That's actually of course why all of the astronauts you ever see coming back from space are always pictured sitting down. They're just incapable of standing. But in this recent study, the scientists had a major breakthrough using a nematode worm. A worm that shows very similar molecular and physiological effects, especially on its muscle performance, when exposed to 0G or microgravity. In other words, this worm also tends to have neuromuscular decline, as observed by various experiments in microgravity. But in this case, these worms were raised in several conditions, and one of these conditions included various types of microbeads that the worms were allowed to interact with, simulating a kind of a physical contact. And so when the worms raised with physical contact were compared to the ones that basically just had nothing, the microbeads somehow re-established the pathways responsible for dopamine and restored a lot of the muscle function in most of these worms, in essence allowing these worms to function almost as well as the ones on planet Earth. And that's actually a pretty big discovery because it means that at least one of the problems, muscle degradation, could be maybe solved. And solved by something as simple as some kind of a massage wand or some kind of a massage apparatus that can produce physical stimulation on a lot of the muscles that we need for walking, for example, and thus prevent the atrophy over time. Although naturally this is still a brand new discovery and no physical solution exists yet, but the theory is definitely sound. And then there are also problems with the bones, the skeletal structure. By being in space, we also lose a lot of bone density. And unfortunately, even after a year, a lot of this density is not recovered in most of the astronauts, with the astronauts spending the time in space the longest being some of the slowest to recover their bone density. And this would be of course a huge issue for anyone going to Mars. After a 3-year Mars mission, which is what we think Martian mission would take, a typical astronaut might lose approximately 33% of bone density, potentially leading to osteoporosis. And although the majority of astronauts today are usually in good health and don't actually notice these differences, for an astronaut going to Mars, this could be a very different story. They would definitely lose at least 1% of bone mass per month spent in outer space. And that's even if they do a lot of exercise on a daily basis. But once again, there's maybe at least one potential solution, and this time it's a pretty intriguing solution that can even work here on Earth. Space salad, or technically space lettuce. Okay, it's actually something that the scientists think they can put in the lettuce that the astronauts can then eat. The medicine known as PTH, also known as parathyroid hormone, can actually stimulate bone formation and can generally help us regrow bone mass even in microgravity. But it does generally also require daily injections. Transporting this to Mars might not be very practical. Instead, the scientists think they can genetically modify some of the plants that the astronauts can easily grow in space, with the genetically modified lettuce then delivering all of the needed medicine. And since in this case the scientists have already been able to produce this particular lettuce, it's now just a matter of growing it in space. Although in this case you would have to eat a lot of this lettuce, at least for now. approximately 8 cups per day, which is about 400 grams, which I'm sure would not really make a lot of astronauts particularly happy. But this can also be done with potentially other food, and so by trying to genetically modify other food, this can potentially deliver a lot of needed medicine to a lot of future astronauts. And since all of this can just be grown in space directly, it would naturally save a lot of space on any potential mission to Mars. But I guess more importantly, some of this genetically modified lettuce can then also be used here on Earth for anyone struggling with the same problems. And so for anyone struggling with osteoporosis, this lettuce might be a solution. And so once again, a lot of space research seems to bring back a lot of important ideas back here to planet Earth. The ideas that we can then use in improving our society and improving our health. But when it comes to space health, there are still a lot of challenges, and any potential mission to Mars still looks pretty dangerous and pretty difficult to achieve. But there's a really big chance that if we're successful, a lot of really good things will come out of all of this research. Which means that we should definitely keep going and keep trying to achieve more and more. But I guess until future discoveries or until the next video in regards to space health, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. Check out previous videos, somewhere right there or in the description below. Subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, and maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.